Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this video will be my monster set DPS guide updated for the Deadlands DLC. Over the past couple of years, really since the introduction of Mythics, we have seen a sharp decline in the use of two-piece monster sets for PvE DPS. The effects from the monster sets have generally been pretty weak, so much so that in situations where you don't use a Mythic, it's typically been better just to mismatch a couple of monster pieces for the flat stats. This was mostly due to the procs from the monster sets not scaling with your stats, and also because they were unable to critically strike. Well, in Update 30, they reworked procs to now scale up with your stats, and then in the upcoming Update 32 DLC, the procs will now once again be able to critically strike. These changes really give a nice boost to the monster sets, and I think many of them will be worth using again for a lot of situations. There are a few exceptions to this rule, as these sets cannot critically strike, and we'll go into a couple of them in more detail in a little bit. Mythic items will still be great. I'm not saying that monster sets are going to magically outparse the kilt on fights where you can keep your full kilt stacks up, but many of the mythics are pretty situational, and they aren't always the best option depending on the specific encounter. So all of this combined with the new cap on crit damage, which overall lowers the boost we get from those mismatched monster pieces that gave us crit chance, it does seem like there are at least a few good monster set options now that are going to be worth running. So for this video, I'll be looking at and giving feedback on 16 of the monster sets that have damage dealing stats on them, and we'll go through them in order from the lowest damaging one to the highest. Keep in mind, this is just in order by the proc damage alone, not necessarily a ranking of them by overall worst to best sets, as some of these sets have special bonuses or better or worse one-piece stats, which will also make a difference in their overall power. I will explain more as I go through each one, and I'll give a summary at the end of which ones I think are going to be the best overall for the upcoming Deadlands DLC. I did test all of these on a Stamina Templar, since Templars don't have any particular passives that would favor any of these monster sets over the others. That way we can get a flat base comparison, but I will have notes on each one about the special boosts that they may get from certain classes or passives. And I did also swap to the appropriate champion point nodes for each parse that would boost the particular monster set I was testing as well. So none of these will be negatively affected by missing CP or anything like that. And one last thing, I won't be going through the details of what each one of these sets do or where they come from, but you can always check out your item set collections tab in the game if you're not sure, or do what I do and use esosets.com to look everything up. Alright, let's go ahead and get into it. First up, we have Marsalok. This set has a one-piece bonus that gives max stam, so not too great for Magicka builds. The DPS I got from this set is 2082, which was by far the lowest. As mentioned earlier, this is one of the few sets that cannot critically strike, and overall it really hurts the potential of it. So for the next column here, the DPS increase, I will go through some rough estimates for how much of an overall DPS increase each of these sets should give. This will factor in their one-piece bonus, the proc damage, and any extra bonuses that the set might give. It will be a rough estimate as there are a lot of factors that change, but I based it off of dealing 100k DPS. So if you're dealing more than that, the percent boost will probably be a little smaller, as the proc damage will account for less of your overall damage than if you were dealing lower damage. The percent boost you'd be getting from the procs would be a bit higher. So using this as an example, at 100k DPS, the 2082 DPS we got from Marsalok is about 2% of our damage. If we were only doing 50k DPS though, that would be 4% of our damage. So I hope that makes sense. Again, these are just general ballpark estimates. So a few things to note about Marsalok is that it does increase in damage based on the number of negative effects on the target. On the trial dummy, we had 15 going, so in a raid that would be a decent bit higher, but I still don't see it being high enough to really crank this proc up to being in a great spot. It also requires you to do a heavy or medium weave every 10 seconds in order to proc it, which can be kind of awkward in some rotations. It does get boosted by Morag Tong if your group has that set going, and also if you're a Necromancer from your Rapid Rot passive, but those aren't really enough to put it in a good spot, and overall not really liking Marsalok much in its current form. I think it needs either a higher base tooltip or much more aggressive scaling if it's going to compete with some of the other options. I'd also love it if they changed the requirement to a heavy attack or a bash instead of only a heavy attack, so that it could be activated in different ways for different playstyles, but as of now I don't see much use for this one. Alright, next up we have Prior Theeric. The proc from this set did just over 3k DPS. While that doesn't look too great on its own, this set also boosts your AoE dots by 5% while the proc is active. The The one piece bonus is also pretty nice with weapon and spell damage. The uptime on the set is not too great though, about 45% is what I got on it, and in my particular setup, my build was about 45% AoE damage, so if you multiply those, overall about a 2% DPS increase from that secondary function that we can add on top of that 3k DPS from the proc. And then if you are a Sorc, your energized passive will increase the proc damage by 5% or 15% if you're a necromancer. So not a bad option, but still not loving it as much as some of the other ones we'll get into later on. Seems like this set could be okay for really short burst stuff where the enemies are dying soon after the proc fades. Next up is Grothdar. The one piece bonus is max magicka, so not too great on stam builds, and the proc itself only gave just over 3k DPS. And unlike prior Theeric, this doesn't have a secondary function to go along with that 3k DPS. It does get boosted by Encratis, Engulfing Flames, which is already included here in that 3k DPS since Engulfing is a standard buff on the trial dummy. And then if you are a DK, you'll also get 5% more damage to it or 15% more as a Necro. But overall, really not too great for sustained DPS. I don't see this one outperforming your standard 2 crit pieces like we've already been running. Another thing to note, if you are using Elfbane, this duration does go from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, so you can get a little more out of it if you're running that, but Elfbane has lost some popularity recently with it being a heavy set and needing to be active on both of your skill bars to properly utilize it. So not a big fan of Grothdar in its current state. Next up we have Dome House. This one is pretty unique as the AoE it puts out actually only deals damage to anything touching the ring. Inside of the ring, it does not deal damage. But if you are inside the ring, you get a bonus 300 weapon and spell damage while that ring is active. I did have to get a little creative with this one to test it out and set up a second dummy as the ring is a little too big to stand in melee range on the primary dummy and have it hit. So I set up the second dummy where the ring would hit it so I could see the damage levels, and then I just parsed like normal on the main dummy. The one piece bonus is not too bad. It does give you both stam and mag, so it can be used equally on either spec, but stam and mag are the worst damage of the possible damage stats you could get on a monster set, but overall still not awful and nice to have some of that off stat to play with too. So we did get a little over 3k DPS from this ring's proc damage, and this set was also updated recently to have both rings hit at the same time instead of choosing the ring based on your highest stat. So you'll always get the physical and the flame damage going out at the same time. The proc alone is not really anything great, but paired with the weapon and spell damage you get, it's actually a pretty nice option. But on the flip side, if you aren't in an encounter with a bigger boss where the ring will actually hit, the weapon and spell damage alone isn't really worth it since the set is up 10 seconds and down 5 seconds at a time. But if you are in a situation where the boss has a bigger hitbox and you can get both, seems like this is back to being a pretty good option overall. And another thing to note is that if you do pair this with Elfbane, it does extend both rings by 5 seconds and also your weapon and spell damage for being in the ring. So you can get close to 100% uptime on it going that route. Pretty situational set, but seems to be one of the more solid options overall. Next up is Infernal Guardian. So I wanted to try this with a hardening enchantment since they updated those to now be able to proc set effects. The infused hardening enchant on our back bar has a 50% chance to proc this every 5 seconds. So the proc is guaranteed every 5 seconds, but the set has a 50% chance to go off when you get a shield. So the uptime wasn't the greatest and we lost our back bar weapon damage enchant to try it out. So overall, even though it gave over 3k DPS, it was a pretty big damage loss. I do wonder if it could possibly be decent with the shield you get from Carve or Brawler. If you are using that as your main spammable, the one piece bonus being Magicka doesn't really synergize too well with that sort of playstyle, but I could see this moving up to maybe the 5 to 6k DPS range, maybe with that kind of spam. I didn't test it out, but maybe one of you have looked at something like that already, so let me know in the comments how it worked out for you if you have. Overall though, pretty niche and probably won't be a super popular option. Next up is Valken Scoria. This gives us offensive pin for the one piece bonus, which is typically a little more useful on medium armor builds, but you can usually swap some stuff around to make it work with light armor too. We got 3300 DPS from this one, but I will note I wasn't in a very dot heavy setup, and it does have a rather low chance to proc only from dot damage. As I mentioned earlier, I did these on my Stamplar, so I bet a more dot heavy rotation on a different class, this could be a little more interesting if you are getting it close to that 5-second cooldown each time. I'm guessing it could get upwards of the 5 to 6k DPS range in those really dot heavy setups, but outside of that seems to be on the lower end of what monster sets can do. It is flame damage, so again will be boosted by Encratis, Engulfing, and the Dragonite passive. So let me know if any of you have messed around with this one on some more dot heavy builds. Next up we have Krog. This one, like Valken, also gives us offensive penetration for the one piece bonus. Krog did 3600 DPS from its proc, and this would be boosted another 5% if you're on a Sork or 15% if you are a Necro. Not really a whole lot to say about this one. It isn't really anything too special for damage, and it doesn't have any secondary effects, but it's nice and easy to get early on, so probably a pretty good starter monster set. Coming up next, we have Veladreth. This gives a nice weapon and spell damage bonus for the one piece, and the proc from it got us about 4200 DPS. We're starting to get into that range now where the procs are pretty close to the increases you'd get from your standard stat pieces. This one doesn't look too great in pure single target, however, it does fire 3 spores out, and those spores can hit an unlimited number of targets. So each target can only take 1 spore at a time every 8 seconds, but say there are 10 enemies stacked up, you could hit all 10 of them with those 3 spores. So that 4200 DPS can start to look a lot better with multiple enemies. But overall, wouldn't really advise this one for a single target fight. I do think it will be pretty fun for some 4-person dungeon stuff though. Next up is Alambris. Aesthetically, this is probably one of my favorite sets in the game. The combined lightning and firestorms are pretty awesome. Damage-wise, it actually is pretty respectable too for an AoE damage proc at almost 4500 DPS. The one piece bonus isn't too great, especially if you are on a stand build, but it looks cool, so who cares? If you are a Sork, your 5% passive will work on half of the damage, same thing with the other half of the damage if you're a Dragonite, and if you're a Necro, you'll get that 15% boost to both sides of the damage. One interesting thing about this is that Elfbane not only boosts the fire damage, but also the lightning damage. The visuals will only show the flame storm for the extended portion, but if you check the damage recap, both parts are still damaging. I'm not sure if this is a bug or intended, but another fun option if you are going the Elfbane route. But even outside of Elfbane, this is giving pretty respectable DPS levels now for a mag build, especially for AoE encounters. Alright, next up we have Zaan. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this is one of the few sets that they decided would not be allowed to critically strike. The one piece bonus is the best we can ask for though on these sets, and the proc damage gave us about 4500 DPS. This is only single target damage though, so while not awful compared to some other options we have for single target or AoE DPS, it doesn't really seem to do anything better than any of the other sets. And you also have to be able to get off all of your beam ticks or you'll lose a lot of damage, and as that beam ramps up in damage, if you miss the last tick, say a boss teleports or something, your DPS will really suffer a lot. So as it stands, I don't really see a PvE use for Zaan right now. There are AoE options that deal as much or more, and single target options that deal more and are less situational than this. I'd love to see this adjusted to maybe scale up over 8 seconds instead of 6 seconds, and then maybe the cooldown reduced to 16 seconds to go with it. This would give it a lot better uptime and also greatly reward you for holding the beam for all of its ticks and offset the fact that it can't critically strike. This may be a bit strong in PvP, but if you can't react to a beam on you within 8 seconds, then that is probably a learn to play issue. So I hope this one gets some tweaks, otherwise it's going to be hanging out in the storage coffers for the Deadlands DLC. Next up we have Iceheart. This also gives us a one-piece crit chance, which is really nice for both mag and stand builds. And then the DPS was surprisingly good with 5300. The damage would also be boosted by another 10% if you're a Warden or 15% if you are a Necromancer. And this set also has the bonus of giving you a damage shield. The shield and the damage last for 6 seconds and can immediately be procced again once they run out. There are a couple of downsides to this set though. First is the radius. The AoE is based on you, and unlike Grothdar, which is 8 meters around you, this only has a radius of 5 meters. So you have to be stacked up pretty close on the enemies to hit with it. The other big drawback is that if you take damage that removes your shield, your frost damage stops too until the shield procs again. So if you're in a fight where you're taking a lot of incoming damage and your shields aren't lasting very long, you might not get very much damage out of this one. But overall, still a very nice set and a nice mix of damage and survivability. This has been a popular set for a while, and I think it will still be pretty nice. Alright, our next one is Kjalnar's Nightmare. This gives us weapon and spell damage on the one piece, so equally good on mag and stand builds. And then the DPS was very nice as well at just over 5600. If you are a Warden, you'll get another 10% on top of that. It is single target only and relies on light attacks, so the better you are at light attack weaving, the better results you'll see from this set. I did hear some rumors about only one person being able to use this at a time. I'm unsure of this being the case, or if it is, if that has been fixed. That would be a bummer, but we'll need some further testing to check that out. Overall though, very easy to proc and very reliable damage. I see this one being pretty popular for the Deadlands DLC. Next we have every tank's favorite set, Maw of the Infernal. Nothing better than having 8 of these bad boys running around breathing fire and blocking your vision. The one piece is a Magicka line, so better suited for Magicka builds, but with the DPS from it being close to 5800, I think you could run it on some stamp setups too, and while it might not be the best option, it could be pretty solid still. It is flame damage too, so Dragonites will see a further boost to that 57-51 DPS I posted, and I do believe the Daedric Prey ability for sorcerers works on it as well to boost it even further. I'm not 100% sure if that's still a thing, but I do believe that works. So let me know down in the comments if anything has changed with that. And then finally, the Maw does proc some extra burning. Not a ton, but enough that I think DKs might lean towards this set for their monster options since they get more burning damage through their passives. Overall, pretty great option for mag builds and probably for stam DKs too. Would be nice if there was an option to hide them for friendlies though. Next up we have Selene. The one piece bonus is stamina, so not too great for a mag setup, but the single target damage is really nice here at almost 6k DPS. This will also get boosted further if you're a sorcerer with their 5% physical damage passive. The big thing with this set is that it only activates on melee attacks, so probably best suited if you're running a full melee build with some configuration of two-hand and dual wield, but just one of those with a ranged back bar would still work out pretty well too. It is only single target damage, so probably not the best option for AoE scenarios, but Selene should be really nice for stand builds when you just have one main target to focus. Alright, the next monster set up is Narayaneth. This gives a nice one-piece weapon and spell damage, and I was really surprised to get over 6200 DPS with this, especially since it is an AoE damage set. It is a pretty tiny AoE though, only 4 meters, so a lot of the time you probably only will be hitting it on a single target, but still really strong damage from this one overall. And you'll get another 10% on top of that from your Warden passive as well. The big drawback here is that it is only a 15% chance when you deal direct damage. So in my case, using jabs as my spammable, those hit 4 times in 1 second. So that paired with my light attack weaved in is 5 chances to proc it in 1 global cooldown. This should work really well with other multi-hit spammables too, like Force Pulse or Rapid Strikes, but its uptime probably won't be nearly as good on other single hit spammables, though I could be wrong there. The cooldown is really short though, only 3 seconds, so sometimes you get lucky and this thing is firing off like crazy. I think it should be pretty popular on Templars and other classes with Force Pulse setups, but we'll see how it does outside of that. Still very nice to see this one doing so well. And finally, the hardest hitting proc out of all the monster sets was Stormfist. This thing hit for 7600 DPS. I was definitely not expecting that when I went into the testing. It is an AoE too, though only 4 meters like Narayaneth, but man, it hits hard. So there are some drawbacks, the glaring one being the one piece bonus. Pretty terrible for Magicka setups and could be okay on stamina setups if you do need the sustain help, but not as good as having a damage stat there. So that does hurt its overall output a bit, but the prog itself does enough damage that it still makes it a better option than a lot of the other monster sets, even with that dud one piece. There is also a short 3-second delay after it procs before the hard-hitting physical damage portion lands, so it is possible to get unlucky and have the enemy move before that part goes off. Just something to keep in mind there, but shouldn't be an issue on more stationary stuff, and 3 seconds isn't that long of a wait either. Sorcerers 5% physical and 5% shock damage will boost both of the aspects of this, so a very nice option there. And Necros will get a little extra damage here, though the dot portion of the ability is not nearly as strong as the physical direct damage portion. I think this one looks pretty great overall though, especially if you need a little sustain help. I'm pretty excited to try this one out on my Stamp Sword. Alright, that wraps up the set. So here is a summary of all the sets we went through. Again, this isn't necessarily ordered by how good the sets are overall, just how much the proc portion of it did specifically. I'd say these 6 here are the ones I'm personally the most excited for in the Deadlands DLC. Kjolnir does seem to be the most versatile for all setups for single target damage, but some specialized setups might see a little more damage with some of the other options here. I think the choice on these will probably be pretty class specific, and depending on how you set up, we'll decide which one you want to go with. But we have a lot of good ones to work with for a lot of different kinds of situations, so I'm pretty excited overall, and aside from a few of these needing some tweaks, I think overall the monster sets are in a pretty good spot. All right, that's going to do it for this video. Let me know which of the monster sets you're looking forward to, and if y'all have done any testing with them yet. I want to give a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see how you can help support the channel through Patreon, I'll have a link in the description below. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Privy League Guild on PlayStation's EU server, Cougar is Bay in the Cougar City Guild, Stridig, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, and my wonderful wife. Thank you all so much for stopping by. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.